When I first arrived at Kamloops Residential School, they made us line up single file. They poured coal oil in my hair and cod liver down my throat. I tried spitting it out, but when I did, they bashed my legs with a large piece of wood. The pain was agonizing, but they forced me to move on and perform the day's tasks. They gave us each numbers and addressed us so. I no longer had a name. As a 5-year-old, I didn't understand what was happening, and when I attempted to ask, they put dirt in my mouth for using my native tongue. They made us go to church and bear through the priest speaking in Latin. I had no idea what he was saying. I remember being starved for large lengths of time. When I was fed, I only received watered-down soup and almost blue-skimmed milk with one piece of butterless bread. Every day consisted of 3 hours of class and 3 hours of labor. If I were to do any of the tasks improperly or refuse to participate, I would be beaten until I could not feel pain anymore. I grew up scared and frustrated with what was happening, and that I no longer had the sense of family. I had lost who I was inside. I had lost the sense of feeling.
South of Hudson's Bay, James Bay, and at the southern tip of James Bay, the settlement of Moose Factory. News Magazine salutes Education Week with films of an Indian residential school 500 miles north of Toronto. For the oldest Canadians, a new future.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. In the 1870s, the federal government, partly in order to meet its obligations to educate Aboriginal children, began to play a role in the development and administration of these schools. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. Most schools were operated as joint ventures with Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, and United Churches. The Government of Canada built an educational system in which very young children were often forcibly removed from their homes, often taken far from their communities. Many were inadequately fed, clothed, and housed. All were deprived of the care and nurturing of their parents, grandparents, and communities. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis languages and cultural practices were prohibited in these schools. Tragically, some of these children died while attending residential schools, and others never returned home. The government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative, and that this policy has had a lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language. While some former students have spoken positively about their experiences at residential schools, these stories are far overshadowed by tragic accounts of the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse and neglect of helpless children and their separation from powerless families and communities. The legacy of Indian residential schools has contributed to social problems that continue to exist in many communities today. It has taken extraordinary courage for the thousands of survivors that have come forward to speak publicly about the abuse they suffered. It is a testament to their resilience as individuals and to the strengths of their cultures. Regrettably, many former students are not with us today, and died never having received a full apology from the Government of Canada. The Government recognizes that the absence of an apology has been an impediment to healing and reconciliation. Therefore, on behalf of the Government of Canada and all Canadians, I stand before you in this chamber so vital, so central to our existence as a country, to apologize to Aboriginal peoples for the role the Government of Canada played in the Indian residential schools system. To the approximately 80,000 living former students and all family members and communities, the Government of Canada now recognizes that it was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions, that it created a void in many lives and communities, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that in separating children from their families, we undermine the ability of many to adequately parent their own children and sow the seeds for generations to follow. And we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that far too often these institutions gave rise to abuse or neglect and were inadequately controlled, and we apologize for failing to protect you. Not only did you suffer these abuses as children, but as you became parents, you were powerless to protect your own children from suffering the same experience. And for this, we are sorry. The burden of this experience has been on your shoulders for far too long. The burden of this experience is properly ours as a government and as a country. There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. You have been working on recovering from this experience for a long time. And in a very real sense, we are now joining you on this journey. The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly. Nous le regrettons. We are sorry. Nimi tatenan, nimin jinowe samin, mamiak tugut. Moving towards healing, reconciliation, and resolution of the sad legacy of Indian residential schools. The implementation of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement began on September 19, 2007. Years of work by survivors, communities, and Aboriginal organizations culminated in an agreement that gives us a new beginning and an opportunity to move forward together in partnership. The cornerstone of the settlement agreement is the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This commission represents a unique opportunity to educate all Canadians on the Indian residential schools system. It will be a positive step in forging a new relationship between Aboriginal peoples and other Canadians, a relationship based on the knowledge of our shared history, a respect for each other, and a desire to move forward with a renewed understanding that strong families, strong communities, and vibrant cultures and traditions will contribute to a stronger Canada for all of us. God bless all of you. God bless our land.
Today there are more than 80,000 people who attended residential schools and are still alive today. These victims suffer from a loss of culture and separation from their families and communities. The physical, mental, and sexual trauma they have experienced have caused most of these people to suffer from alcohol abuse and drug addiction to mask the pain they deal with inside and out. Due to the fact of growing up without parents, many struggle with parenting their own children properly because they were never passed down the knowledge, leading to a vicious cycle from generation to generation. Yes, the apology Stephen Harper made was sufficient for the purposes of helping to heal the abuse and mistreatment that occurred in residential schools. It's understanding that the apology cannot fix everything and certainly won't ever make the events that happen justifiable. Yet the apology is necessary for Canada and the Aboriginals to turn a new leaf in the history we continue to create. No amount of dollars and no amount of recognition will cover up the scar tissue that lays upon the surface of this issue, but without the proper apology, the First Nations people cannot begin to forgive the government, and without the forgiveness, the bitterness will continue to withhold the healing process.